Three excellent papers. My question is a broader one. I think it's probably for Dr. O'Connor. You spoke about the growth of socialism in an international context at the start of the 20th century. Could you say something about the impact of the increased threat of social militancy and the way in which did this create conditions which contributed or facilitated the outbreak of war?
The growth of militancy?
Of social militancy in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
To what degree did that create conditions in a European context that led to the outbreak of war or contributed towards the outbreak of war?
Yeah, well, there was a general growth of militancy, you know, throughout the industrial world. And in looking at the situation in Belfast, you have to put it in its international context. I mean, that comparison, that reference that to between Belfast and St. Petersburg that John mentioned, you know, that is indicative of the way in which people were making these comparisons. And the kind of strike that happened in Belfast is kind of like, you know, what was going on in other places. You had similar kinds of generalized strikes in places like, you know, Barcelona and St. Petersburg and so on. And the Larkinism was typical of that escalation of militancy. Now, the Second International, which had been set up in 1889 as a kind of loose confederation of socialist parties, they were very conscious of the growing militarism, the growing great power rivalry, and they argued that, well, one of their big concerns was to prevent another war, and they argued that in the event of the outbreak of war, that they would call a general strike. But of course, that didn't happen. And when the German Social Democrats voted war credits to the German state in August 1914, that was a huge shock to the European socialist movement, because the German Social Democratic Party was generally seen to be the biggest and the best organized socialist party in the world at that time. They ran 60 daily newspapers at a time when the British Labour movement was struggling to produce one in the Daily Herald. So things kind of, you know, that kind of confidence that was there in socialism did collapse, I think, in the summer of 1914. But the war revived it in a different kind of context by late 1917, 1918. And again, there was a strong feeling that things were going to be very different after the war, and the war would lead to this new age of democracy. Then these hopes were then dashed again by the slump in 1920-23.
I'd just like to make two brief points. The first is one can be sort of overly pessimistic about the effects of nationalism on the fortunes of the labour movement in Ireland, if indeed one considers how the much more powerful European labour movements capitulated to the forces of nationalism on the eve of the First World War. I mean, literally in the space of 2 or 3 weeks, they somersaulted from a position of we're going to hold a great general strike and put a stop to voting for war budgets particularly in the French and German parliaments. The second point that's perhaps worth remembering is that you know, you can think of the Irish Citizen Army as being a sort of homegrown Irish nationalist stroke labour militia, but in fact the idea of a citizens' army or a citizens' militia, well, in an Irish context perhaps you could say it went back to the Irish volunteers, but in a European context you find all the socialist papers. For example, in 1907, the Glasgow socialist paper Forward has a big article about the arguments for a citizen army. You know, and this is as an alternative to this other official army, which will be used to smash strikes and will get us into all sorts of European wars we don't want to fight in. So the idea for an Irish citizen army was not some sort of genie out of the Irish bottle. It was one that drew on European ideas.
You also got, before the First World War, suffragettes in England were doing sort of militarism as well. You know, there's a Vane, I think was his name, Sir Francis Vane, who was a friend of Sylvia Pankhurst's, and he was involved in later in the inquiry into the shooting of, among other people, Francis Sheehy Skeffington. But he would have trained suffragettes. They did military training on the kind of Hackney Marshes, probably somewhere where the Olympics or something is going to be happening today. So there was this incredible sort of militarization of, and Tom Mann was also the kind of great sort of English syndicalist leader, was calling for people's armies and things in the vein of your point too.
And of course, it's the rush of the working classes across Europe, you know, following the kings and the emperors that drives Connolly towards the idea of an Irish revolution. By 1914, he begins to gravitate towards, you know, involvement, what becomes his involvement in 1916 and in the Rising, committing his citizens' army to that.